Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Biomedical Engineering Society's webinar on regulatory standards and risk management in medical devices. My name is Ben No. I'll be your moderator for today. I serve as the BMES Industry Committee Chair within the organization, and I also work as a project manager at Medtronic in Boulder, Colorado. So just a few announcements before we get started. First off, the archive recording will be available a few days afterwards on the BMES website. Also, if you look on the lower left of your screen, you'll see a chat function. So as we go through the content this afternoon, feel free to submit questions via the chat function down there, and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. Also, as we complete the webinar, please stay on for a few minutes and complete a brief survey that will give us some feedback on how we can improve webinars in the future. So first, before we jump into the content, just wanted to grab a few demographics from the audience. So first of all, please respond to which of the following best describes you. Are you a student, postdoctoral fellow, faculty, industry professional, or not any of those listed? I'll give it a few more seconds here, and then I'll go ahead and close the poll. Perfect. So it looks like a few students in the call as well as an industry professional. Next question, for those of you in industry and those of you who might have had internships or co-ops, how many years of work experience do you have within industry? Looks like we have a good mix of some senior professionals and then also a few early career folks as well. Next question is, what is your primary role within your company? Do you work primarily in R&D, quality and new product development, or quality and manufacturing, the regulatory affairs function, operations, or another area? Perfect. So it looks like primarily R&D and then one other area that's not mentioned on here. And then last question, how much experience do you have with quality systems and risk management processes? Would you consider yourself an expert? Do you have some experience or little to no experience? Perfect, thank you. Looks like an even split across each of those. So we're joined today by a few professionals from Deloitte who are going to speak on regulatory standards and risk management in medical devices. So I just wanted to go through and introduce each of our speakers today. First is George Serafin, who is the National Leader of Deloitte & Touche Life Sciences and Healthcare Regulatory Risk and Compliance Advisory Practice. He has 30 years of experience working in numerous functional areas within the medical device, diagnostics, biopharmaceuticals, healthcare, and consumer industries. So welcome, George.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. Also, we have Mudahar Shamsi, who is a specialist leader in Deloitte & Touche Life Sciences and Healthcare Regulatory Risk and Compliance Advisory Practice. Prior to joining Deloitte, Mudahar had a distinguished 30-year career at the FDA, having served the last 5 years as the New England District Director. He also recently served as the Interim Program Lead of the FDA's Medical Device and Radiological Health Program Alignment Action Plan for 2015. Welcome to you, Mudahar, as well, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, you're most welcome. I'm happy to participate. And good afternoon, everybody.
And then lastly, we have Nicole Shoemaker, who is a Senior Manager in Deloitte's Life Sciences and Healthcare Regulatory Risk and Compliance Advisory Practice. She has over 10 years of experience consulting for medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and biotechnology companies. So again, thanks for joining us today, Nicole.
Thank you.
Yep. And George, I'll pass it over to you.
Appreciate it, Ben. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Nicole, Mudahar, and I are very excited to spend the next just about an hour with all of you in talking about the regulatory framework as it exists with respect to medical devices and also risk management. But before we did that, I appreciated Ben's introductions of all of us Each of us have a biomedical engineering background, and I thought, given the audience on the phone, it might be helpful and some insightful to hear from each of us just a little bit more about how our biomedical engineering education and backgrounds have influenced our careers. So Nicole, starting with you, just wanted to share a couple of your thoughts.
Yeah, so as George mentioned, I have a biomedical engineering degree. Started out my career actually at NASA doing engineering on their Advanced Space Life Sciences program, but soon after graduate school moved into consulting to really get a broad range of experiences. The great thing about what we do is we get to interact with so many different companies, so many different products, and I'm able to use that biomedical engineering background to really help clients solve complex problems. Some of them have an engineering slant to the problem that we're dealing with, and some of them, basically engineers they're very core problem solvers, and so some of them, some of the issues that we deal with, the engineering skills that I learned back in school come in handy when just serving clients and solving problems in general. So I've been able to take a unique path with the biomedical engineering degree, but still keep close to the science and to the core of BMES.
Thanks, Nicole. Mudahar?
Hi, good afternoon. I also have a degree in biomedical engineering, and I started with the Food and Drug Administration right out of college. We were talking beforehand, I had never even heard of the FDA or very much regulations when I was in school. Not much attention was paid to it. But as it turned out, I ended up working for the only field device lab that FDA has in the country, and it's outside of Boston. And, like Nicole's experiences, you get to see the wide range of devices, manufacturers, and even things that aren't related to medical devices, such as blood manufacturing components, food, the way food's manufactured. It's a very interesting area that FDA regulates, and I think my engineering education really helped. It was basically tailor-made for the type of job that I initially started with the agency and continued on. So, when I first went to the major, people were wondering, well, why do you want to do such a it was an unknown major 30 years ago, and no one really heard of it. And they wonder what you're going to do with it. But it's a great major. There's lots of things. The world is wide open for all the different things you can do as a biomedical engineer, and great ride.
Thanks, Mudahar. And quickly about myself, I mentioned 30 years in the industry. I started as a research assistant, actually working for Sandoz, now Novartis. I had the opportunity to do my senior design or capstone project for them, and luckily enough to come in and work with them. And then throughout my career, really spent time across R&D into tech transfer, engineering, kind of the entire value chain going into manufacturing, supply chain. And when you're around long enough, you get to touch a lot of different things before coming onto the professional services side. And one of the things we've noticed as we continue to service our clients is just the strength of the biomedical engineering program and academic foundation, coupled with some internships or work experience, that really just give another career path for biomedical engineers. So again, we're very excited. My team's very excited to spend some time with you. So we have 3 objectives for today's session. We're going to talk about the existing regulatory framework. This will again be a global framework we're talking about, not just FDA. And that's a majority of what we're talking about in terms of laying down the groundwork and the foundation. We're going to talk about a couple of initiatives that are going on with FDA, so we will be a bit more domestic-centric, as well as EU for the second part of our discussion. And then lastly, wrapping up with disruptors and understanding that there's obviously emerging technologies, exponentials that are out in the marketplace that are also hold a huge opportunity and promise for our industry, but also come with its own set of challenges and risks. So teeing into the regulatory compliance landscape, I just want to take a minute here and tee this up for everyone. So at the top of the slide here, you look at a variety. This is by no means all-encompassing. That's just telling you how many regulations are out there around the medical device space, and in addition to biopharmaceuticals. But really, if you think about the number of regulations, and we've tried to map them as much as possible around what we'll call the value chain in life sciences. So research and development, regulatory affairs, manufacturing, supply chain, post-market surveillance. So this is when a product is already out in the market. And how is that continued to be closely monitored and managed, especially with risks to patient safety and also efficacy. And then commercial operations. And there's regulations around that as well. So you can see there's a significant amount that manufacturers, distributors, in addition caregivers have to be able to comply with on a day-to-day basis that really go across that entire value chain. And then below, you could see that where I would say kind of regulatory processes. Obviously, there's hundreds of different functions or processes within organizations, but this is just highlighting some of the main ones that are most highly regulated. So if you work in the R&D space, you're going to see a lot around good clinical practices, which is bringing medical products to market, managing clinical trials, certainly reporting any adverse events through those trials. And then you'll see regulatory, which is more, again, creating the market authorizations for different markets. Manufacturing, a bit more straightforward and making sure that you're manufacturing the product very well. But the big tie back with devices is obviously very, very strong tie with respect to design controls back into research and development. So understanding that you can design quality in from the start, and any feedback that you get as part of during the manufacturing process or into the post-market, how that gets fed back into the design process to continue to improve product quality. Ludo Hart will talk about that in a few minutes. Post-marketing surveillance focuses on, again, more of the detection of any adverse events and trends that are happening in the marketplace, and that's on globally, not just in particular markets. And then also, what do you need to do to get the product to market in the commercial operations? So this is a wide variety of things that you have to do, in the marketplace, and some of those are regulated functions as well. So really, to tee up for this slide, it's a very intricate, complex framework, all with the intent of helping manufacturers develop and manufacture high-quality medical devices, and also that are efficacious to patients, and have a very strong safety profile, so it's not hurting anybody. Ludo, I turn it over to you.
Sure. This slide isolates about 9 of those regulations that were shown on the previous slide, or are the subsets of them. And they all form a building block toward a quality system. One of the things you'll hear a lot of are GMPs in the pharma world. In the device world, they're known as quality system regulations. And just the numbers are just references in the law as to what sections they are and where they are. But as you can see here, it's not just FDA, domestically that someone has to worry about, but there's also international standards that are something that you need to be aware of and consider adhering to. And in addition, what FDA regulates is not just, say, your everyday medical devices, but they also regulate electronic products, things that have lasers in them. They also have quite a few standards on mammography machines. That's 21 CFR 8900. And the way these rules are written and regulations are written, they are very vague, but so that they can be tailored to something as simple as medical devices in this country are classified within 3 tiers: 1, 2, and 3. 1 being the least risky, where not many controls are needed, and 3 being the most, where you would need a pre-market approval in order for it to get marketed in the United States. So these regulations cover the gamut from tongue depressors and tongue scrapers to CT machines, defibrillators, anything that any type of device you could think of. Right. And as I mentioned, you've got FDA regulations, which are, if you want to market, distribute any type of medical device in the United States, you have to follow the FDA regulations. And the ISO guidance is just that, they're standards. However, if you want to sell those products globally, you need to meet those requirements as well. And just the point we want to make here on this slide is that These aren't the FDA standards, the FDA regulations, and the ISO standards are not in conflict. They are harmonized, and they have the same sort of controls as documentation, handling complaints, design controls. They're just maybe in different sections, but they essentially say the same thing. And so it's just one of these things you have to be aware of. That if you want to compete globally, you need to look at both FDA regulations and those outside the United States. And again, just to show that how they are harmonized, if on this particular graph, the vertical column on the left, and I think it's blue, those are the general sections of the FDA quality systems regulations. You can see you got production and process control, anywhere from quality system requirements, and across the top horizontally in the gray boxes are what they're categorized in the ISO 1345 requirements. And you can see they match up pretty much in every block. So, under management responsibility, that's also covered under the quality systems regulations. So, this slide, and one of the things I want to point out is design control. That's also something that's spelled out in both regulations, acceptance activities, things that are that you would consider part of any sort of normal everyday quality system. Next slide is just again more records is a big part. You need to prove to the agency and to other authorities that you actually are following these regulations. So records and documentation are extremely important. Those have to be done. There's a saying that if it's not documented, it's not done. And again, there's other areas here where you can see there is overlap. And just to tie all that together, since there are what looks like, say, two different standards, you've got the FDA and you've got ISO, and that's just different ones. There is an initiative, and it's no longer a pilot. It's an actual initiative right now where if you get inspected by an authority from 4 countries, either Australia, Brazil, Canada, or Japan, and they will probably inspect you to an ISO standard, that can be used as a qualifying FDA inspection. So what that means is if you get inspected by one of those 4 authorities, you will not get inspected by the agency, by FDA. And so that's a good thing, and it shows a couple things. One, that the regulations are harmonized. 2, not trying to put too much of a burden on industry by having an ISO inspection and an FDA inspection. I mean, really, when you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. Just one inspection covers all areas, and help manufacturers, helps commerce, and also saves governments quite a bit of money. And over to Nicole.
So moving on to the European Union from the FDA, they have similar regulations around devices, but actually have very different constructs on how they regulate. And one of the big things that's coming up in the EU is really this new medical device regulation. So 4 years of political negotiations are expected to reach a conclusion in the next couple months as the European Council finalizes its position on reforming the legislation surrounding medical devices. And on this slide, you can see where they're really focusing for the new EU medical device regulation. So there's going to be traceability and transparency, so increased awareness of where medical devices are being used, how they're being used, and any issues that are coming up with them, and some increased reporting around that. Some focus on specific issues, particularly around cosmetic use products and reprocessing of single-use devices. So this is something that the FDA actually touched on fairly recently, and there's been some increased legislation on the pharma side and the cosmetic side in the EU since 2011 in these areas, but this will now extend into the device area. There will be also an increased focus on clinical evaluations, with more pre- and post-market evaluations coming online, and a real focus on the overall life cycle of the devices. So the inception of devices all the way through to the actual use of those devices and any information coming back. There also will be a new management of notified bodies system put in place. It'll help to increase some pre-market authorizations, and harmonize and strengthen designation and oversight for medical devices. Obviously, all of this will be wrapped around a directive to the regulation that will encourage less national variation, a stricter interpretation. In general, medical devices have had a slightly broader berth when it comes to interpreting the regulations, where this new EU legislation is hoping to tighten up some of those gray areas and focus a little bit more on harmonization and specificity around the regulations, and separating national law to define enforcement. Back into some of the ISO standards that we've been talking about, one of the big things is really ISO 14971, which is the application of risk management to medical devices. So this is where a lot of the concepts that you're learning as biomedical engineers and you're applying as biomedical engineers come into play, and that there's a lot of focus around making sure that the risks associated with any one given device are thought through and managed appropriately. We know that there's no such thing as, a risk-free activity, but understanding what the risks are and being able to either design some of the risk out or being able to mitigate the risk is really, really key. And so there are regulatory requirements around these standards, and conformity with the standard may help some medical device manufacturers to meet design validation requirements. So these requirements are really around making sure that the design is sound and created properly, and it's part of the pre-market review process for an evaluation of a medical device. So the pre-market review process for medical devices is much less cumbersome than what you would find on the pharmaceutical side, but this is one of the key elements to making sure that the device is sound and able to be used in a safe way going forward. One of the other things that's really been a hot topic in recent years, particularly as things like analytics and dashboarding and understanding broader safety issues come up, is really the emerging post-market medical device signals guidance. So signals have been a very important part of life sciences in general for quite some time, and the pharmaceutical side has had very strict regulations around the signals. And this is a step towards that, a similar focus on signals in the medical device industry. And so the FDA has recently released some guidance around medical devices that are being used in clinical practice and emerging signals that are being seen there. So signals really are a place to take all of the information that we're getting on potential malfunctions of devices, potential misuse of devices, or any other issues that may be coming up, and scanning through those to understand if it's a problem that needs to be remediated or if it's a single error. And so there's a new focus on emerging signals, and the FDA is saying that they are going to monitor and analyze these signals early, and even before it's determined that there's an actual issue with the device, making some conscious decisions to make communications available about those emerging signals so that consumers can make some specific decisions about their care and their use of devices going forward. So this is something that is looked to be implemented in the next couple of years. The draft guidance just came out at the end of last year and is out for comment at this time. But this would help healthcare providers and patients and consumers to make risk-benefit decisions on their own about the devices that they use, even though not all of the information would be confirmed by manufacturers or the FDA at that time, but would be almost an early warning signal that people could take into account as they make decisions about their care. The companies and the FDA would obviously continue to analyze these emerging signals to confirm the signals and see if there's any change that needs to be made to benefit risk profile. but this really is around timely communication of any issues that may come up. Mudahar?
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. Just a couple of things. In the next few slides, we'll be showing you some new guidance that the agency has published. And just on the second line, this is available for comment. And, we live in a democracy, so the agency just cannot just throw out any type of guidance or rules that they feel like. When they do it, it has to be submitted for public comment. And it's typically 90 days that they're out there. Sometimes you get an extension. But, the agency, if you're really interested in this, I would encourage you to go to the FDA's website. And also, if you go to, there's another government website where you can see all the regulations from all the different agencies that are offer comment, and it's actually very interesting. The second thing I want to point out here is that when we showed you these slides on the quality systems regulations, there are some fairly specific regulations on monitoring complaints and submitting adverse events, and since they are codified, there are legal ramifications for not following that. And so I believe the intent of this particular guidance is to have the agency act a little bit quicker, and as Nicole said, much more timely communication on something that may be happening that the public isn't aware of. A lot of times manufacturers are a little, I won't say afraid, but may want to hold back a bit because they're afraid of any legal ramifications, and you want to make sure that legally you're on sound ground before you say anything. But the problem there is the risk-benefit ratio. How long do you wait before you say something that may be helpful to the medical community or to patients? So I think that's the intent of this. I think it's going to be very controversial, because a lot of companies may not want to give this information out, but again, you have to think of the patient and the health and safety of the patient.
Thank you, Mudahar. I'm going to move over into cybersecurity for medical devices. And really here, again, another draft guidance, as Mudahar had indicated, that came out at the beginning of the year. And it's amazing if I go back in my career, after being in the lab and I wanted to get closer to med tech, I was in pharma first and I went to med tech, wanted to get a little closer to devices. One of my first roles was developing communication protocols and interfaces of different medical device instrumentation based on RS-232 interfaces. And back then, as a design team, we didn't think anything about cyber risk or connecting into something called the internet or any of that. And now we're at a point where, because everything is so wired, this was something that became a key risk for the agency, and therefore they needed to put out some guidances. First on pre-market, so as you're getting into actually marketing device, and then post-market. One of the first things here that you had to recognize around this draft guidance was really just to level set on definitions. And what do we mean by vulnerability? What do we mean by controlled and uncontrolled risk? Compensating controls, what is that? And how would you describe essential clinical performance? So I won't spend time going through all the definitions, but this was a key thing to put those definitions out. They're available for comment, and each of them have their own ramifications or impact, as you'll see as we go into the next slide, because of what FDA wants you to be able to do with it. So here you can see kind of the two areas being looked at, as I mentioned, pre-market and post-market. Pre-market really focuses in on the design validation, and you can see below a couple of the different areas that key areas that are a focus. And then also on the post-market side, which now after the device is out in the industry, what do we need to do with respect to monitoring and understanding what vulnerabilities exist, and then also how can they be remediated. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on here in terms of reporting vulnerabilities. The FDA was also very interested in saying, if you have a robust quality system and you're able to quantify or qualify here controlled and uncontrolled risk, that there's certain criteria that you could follow based on this guidance to say that you don't need to report this information to FDA. We understand that it's part of how your responsibility as a manufacturer for identifying problems or errors and how you can fix or remediate those. without having to go through more of a formal communication channel. That's easier to do certainly on a controlled risk side, which is considered to be sufficiently low or acceptable. On the uncontrolled risk side, obviously more clarity required, and in understanding that if all of the following circumstances are met, then it's saying it does not intend to enforce reporting requirements. So again, the FDA trying to not impose undue compliance requirements on organizations, but also balancing all of us are consumers of our healthcare ecosystem with medical devices. So certainly we want to know if there's a vulnerability and something can get hacked and potentially harm any of us, whether it's ourselves, whether it's our loved ones. We certainly want to know about it, and that's what the mission of the FDA is. So they have to balance that as part of their legal responsibility and public service mission.
Yeah, I just want to add on the cybersecurity one as well. Georgia said quite clearly that the agency really doesn't want to handcuff people and wants to be a bit more proactive than reporting any type of fixes they make to prevent any cybersecurity issues. So rather than have to formally report them, if you fix these things, the agency may not require a formal report, which is, again, to make it a least burdensome approach for the industry. And also, in addition, the industry needs to also talk with each other. If they get involved in groups, if you have a particular device and it's susceptible to a certain type of communication standard or protocol, you shouldn't keep that to yourself. That should be, publicized and made known to others in the industry, so they can also speak there as well. So one of the other, I think this is the last draft guidance that we'll talk about, and this came out just recently, actually came out this month. And this has to do with data integrity. And this one, it's geared toward the pharmaceutical industry. There are some parallels to the medical device industry. And the reason why this particular guidance was submitted is that the agency has actually seen a lot of violations with really the agency doesn't have confidence in a lot of the data that they're looking at during inspections or during pre-market review. And it's actually disconcerting because the agency relies on honest results when they make decisions. So again, here are some definitions, about data integrity, and what the agency expects. So this basic definition, of audit trail, we'll back up. We'll go to the next slide. Now these are things where it's almost common sense. You shouldn't make data up. You shouldn't test things till they pass. You shouldn't hide any data. You need to keep proper signatures. A lot of it's common sense, but you'd be surprised to see how many people just don't follow that. And the next one, this is another interesting one. This one actually isn't law yet. It's something that was, the reason why it's brought up is because in this particular Congress anyways, to get anything that passes with bipartisan votes is something noteworthy. And this particular bill, which passed the House last year, really wants to sort of make it a little bit easier on industry and less burdensome to address, technology as it just skyrockets, every day. And one of the more interesting proposals is redefining what health software is. Currently, health software is defined as a medical device in the Act, and if it's defined as a device, there are, once you're defined as a device, all these controls have to be put in place. Congress would like to exempt that, which would be interesting. And another thing is that during clinical trials, the other things I want to point out too, this is almost a cradle-to-grave type proposal where it's looking at clinical trials as well as manufacturing. So streamlining clinical trials, when you do a clinical trial, whether it's in a drug or device, especially in drugs, it's very, very time-consuming, lots of controls, lots of reporting, and trying to make those a little bit less burdensome and try to share data more. You're not repeating data sets that have already been done by other companies. And improving the way the agency looks at the regulatory process. So maybe using more, we talked earlier about other authorities doing inspections, maybe using more third parties instead of relying on the agency to conduct establishment inspections, and an emphasis on getting sort of better trained employees at the agency, and and then also there's medical there's certain devices that can be marketed for people that have for a small population of people, and making that a little bit easier to develop as well.
So thank you, Mudahar. I know you're going to go through the next couple of slides around strategic initiatives. Just in fairness to time, I know for everyone on the line, you'll have the recording. You could actually pause it and stop and look at these in a bit more detail. But if you could just go through a couple of the highlights of those, that would be great.
So again, to show that the agency is really trying to keep up with the times, these are the Center for Devices and Radiological Health is the entity in the FDA that monitors medical devices. And so what they're working on the next couple of years is to look at three things. Looking at a national evaluation system for devices, partnering with patients. This is an important one. They want to use the voice of the patient, seeing what they think about, how they think about their treatment, how they felt during the clinical trial. And the other one that I think is ultimate worthy is getting a culture of quality within the agency. That's something that was really severely lacking. So they themselves want to get ISO 9001 certified, which I think is admirable. And the next are the overall FDA initiatives. And again, it's just three things here. Again, the focus on quality, data transparency, and stakeholder engagement. Let's look at data transparency. The agency does have a lot of the adverse events they have, otherwise known as medical device reports, are publicly available, and they can be used by a third party to develop apps. There's increasingly, the agency is getting involved with industry groups to look at initiatives such as case of quality, which we'll be talking about later on, and just focusing on not just meeting the regulations, which a lot of companies get trapped in, but going beyond that and really making a product that's of high quality and safe for people to use.
As Mudahar just mentioned, there's something called the Case for Quality, which is a movement that's being sponsored by the FDA, but really is something that's an industry-wide activity to really change the focus and the lens on how quality is approached. So the Case for Quality is really representing a movement to foster a new culture of quality across the medical device industry. And the new culture aims to enhance patient safety by shifting the medical device industry from a narrow focus on compliance to a higher sustained level of product quality overall. The Case for Quality movement is really meant to move from compliance to quality. So the compliance and all the regulations that we've been talking about are really focused on making sure that you produce a consistent device as you've designed it. This new movement is really stepping back from that, making sure that compliance is still a key factor and that everyone is still compliant. But compliance doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a good device. It just means that it's going to be consistent and designed to your specifications. The culture of quality is really to shift a little bit of the mindset into looking at how quality actually can be built into the overall process and how that can foster a variety of benefits, both from a compliance perspective as well as from a patient safety perspective. Because really the industry and the FDA both have the same goal to create safe devices for patients that foster new enhanced treatments for everyone to be able to use. So the overarching goals of the Case for Quality really are to identify and promote manufacturers' implementation of systemic practices and provide consumers and caregivers and the end users of all of these devices with a new level of information around the quality of the medical devices that they're using. We've all heard a lot about, the quality of generic drugs versus branded prescription drugs. but this is also a step towards being able to have people informed about the quality of their medical devices, regardless of where they're coming from, but giving those end users a little bit of empowerment around what devices that they're using and how they're using it. And really to facilitate innovation and quality by providing an additional level of data and analysis around the devices, to expand some of the oversight practices to include varied interactions with stakeholders across the value chain for medical devices, to promote that focus on device quality. All of this is converging right now. This is something that's still very much in development, but there's multiple work streams that are being utilized across a variety of professional societies that are out there to be able to foster some of the case for quality activities that are going on. And one of the things that is currently going on is a development of a quality system maturity model that would include metrics and analytics about the devices, both the way that they're being used at the end user area, as well as metrics coming from the device manufacturers, so that consumers can actually make an informed decision on things. And this maturity model would take one of those steps away from that really compliance-focused view of medical device manufacturing, more towards a quality-focused view. Obviously, everyone still has to maintain compliance with all the regulations that we've been talking about, but really then taking the next step and saying who is creating the most quality device that's out there, and what are the best practices in the industry to continue to do that.
Great, Nicole.
George?
Thanks for that. Thank you. So now you've heard from us in terms of really kind of doing a very quick overview around the regulatory framework and some specific guidances and around the initiatives. I wanted to wrap up our conversation and open it up to Q&A. You're really talking about what's next. And so a couple of different areas here. I won't do a deep dive on each of them, but just kind of putting it out there, food for thought. And some of you could be also, in part of your research or current work responsibilities, invested in these very, very exciting areas. So if you think about cloud computing and the ability to go over and not have on-premise or having infrastructure within respective companies and being able to outsource or have in the cloud anything from clinical data and actually communication with patients out on this cloud database to leveraging your current technology infrastructure that would typically be a row of servers in your facilities that now are being third-party hosted, and some of the ramifications about the risks associated with now having those outside of your respective responsibilities. A very huge one is around digital health and Internet of Medical Things, as we're calling it here. Probably all of you would hear it more as IoT. Internet of Medical Things is now catching on as a nomenclature. Specifically now you're talking about how you're looking at wearables or other devices from a digital health perspective that are patient support systems and others that are now in the more medical side. And of course you have that cross intersection of consumerism now with health as well. Artificial intelligence around clinical algorithms, you're able to get and assimilate all that information and actually now use AI to start making some interpretations of the data rather than human intervention until a much later stage. 3D printing, additive manufacturing is very exciting. Not that there's new regulatory pathways. You'll follow the same regulatory pathways as you print a medical device. But how does the quality management system, as Moderator went through, how does that evolve? How do you go over and bring those devices to market again in the full intent that's there? And then, of course, your big data or advanced analytics. How can you now leverage all this information? Both Nicole and Moderator talked about this in terms of the predictive signaling and measures that have to be there. So a lot of exciting things on the forefront. And again, it's applying the standard or current existing regulatory framework that all of your respective organizations, or if you're going out out into organizations after you finish school, these are things that are top of mind with all of them. And with that, Ben, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you, George and Mudahar and Nicole. Great presentation and overview of the quality systems and regulatory standards, both in the United States and around the world. So just a quick reminder to the audience here, if you have any questions on any of the content of today's presentation, use that chat function in the lower left of your screen, and we'll address those at this time. We did have a few questions that came in, so we'll start with those. First, to the presenters today, can you speak to risk evaluations for new software releases for a product that's already on the market?
Sure. Why don't I take that one, Ben? Mudahar, Nicole, feel free to jump in. So a couple of key things I'm queuing in on your question. One is it's a current product already on the market. So I would focus on the risk evaluation specifically through your change control process. So as you're going through and looking at the new version, what are the changes to that new version and how do those impact or influence the existing regulatory or risk evaluation, which again has got to be more patient safety focused, in addition to also incorporating the appropriate regulatory pieces as well, and then making any additional adjustments to that. Based on some of the changes in the version, your failure mode and effects analysis may need to be updated or added to. That could change some of the weighting, could change some of the controls that would need to be there to make sure, or compensating controls that would need to be in there to make sure, again, to keep the safety profile at its current level as well. Mudahar, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Within the design control regulations in 2030, there is a requirement for risk evaluation. There's also the ISO 14971 standard on during risk. There's also a lot of it depends. If you find the answer to things where you ask someone from the agency or maybe anyone else, depends on what the change is. If you're making a change that to fix a problem that you found, it may require a new submission or an addendum. And a lot of it depends on how the original device was approved, what language was in that submission that allowed the agency to approve it. So if there's any sort of substantial change to that, it may require a new submission.
And just building on that, I'm separating here new version in terms of more of a product version versus a correction, because that has different implications in terms of, to what you were just building on, Mudahar, which is if this is a response to a problem that is known, and now a new version or a correction is being going out there, again, that has implications to whether or not what level of communication is required to the agency. Correct.
Well, perfect. Thank you. Another question that came in, going back to the topic of cybersecurity, are there regulations governing wireless components within medical devices? And if so, what is required for those wireless registrations?
Yeah, so another great question. I appreciate those. So I'll jump on this and jump on this one as well and open it up to my colleagues to answer. So two things. One is recognizing that any of the components within the device are still regulated by the quality system and design control, all the things we've been talking about. So that is there. Recognizing that wireless is now, again, a bit differently, two things to consider. One, there is a guidance from FDA on radio frequency wireless technology in medical devices. You can find that on the website. It was issued in August of 2013. It's a very good document, so I can give you some additional information there in terms of understanding with service providers, what quality of service, electromagnetic compatibility, and other key considerations are outlined in that guidance. The other thing to think about is that this is an intersection between FDA and FCC. So depending on the wireless communications, FCC regulates the bands. So they actually regulate the bands that the wireless information would go over, whereas FDA regulates the information itself, except for if you look at HIPAA. Now that's a separate regulatory requirement in terms of privacy. So you'd have FDA's focus on the actual intent of the device and the safety of the device, the information that's being communicated. You have HIPAA, which is looking at privacy and making sure that those regulatory requirements are being satisfied, and then the third being FCC, if indeed you're trying to secure a particular band that FCC would regulate. Mudahar, Nicole, any other comments?
Yeah, this is Matara. I was just going to say, as far as FDA is concerned with the question that's in other new FDA regulations, and I'm paraphrasing here, there aren't any regulations specifically to wireless devices, and you got to be careful when you say regulations and guidance. The regulations are what's codified and they're passed by Congress, and guidance. The guidance documents that we've talked about earlier are just that, the recommendations. They don't have the full force and effect of law. So these guidance documents are very good because it shows you what the agency is thinking, but they aren't legally bound. The agency is not bound legally to enforce those documents. But if it's a regulation, then they are.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you very much for that explanation. Looks like that's about all the time we have for questions today. So just a few reminders before we finish up. The archived recording, again, will be available on the BMES website in a couple of days. And as we close out here, please stay on to complete the survey. Provides us some feedback on how to better improve the webinars and what other topics you're looking to see on these webinars. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.